I am incredibly excited to be reconvening this afternoon session by introducing to you Leigh Schumann, if I can find her. Oh, hi. Hi, Leigh. I've actually known Leigh for the better part of 2 decades, and I have to admit I'm a pretty big fan. Leigh is a founder and principal at Fawkes and Holly, the founder and the executive director at the Lipstick Project, and a committed fundraising professional who is passionate about equipping small charities with the tools and strategies they need to make a big impact. Ladies and gentlemen, here to talk to you about mastering donor retention, Leigh Schumann.
Hello, everybody. It's so nice to be here. Thank you, Najid, and to the Kila team for having me. As mentioned, I'm thrilled to share with you my thoughts and experience on donor retention today. So as Najid mentioned, yeah, there we go. So as Najid mentioned, I work at a company called Fawkes and Holly, and we are a group of professional fundraisers with a background specifically in annual giving and mid-level giving, with a focus also on strategic communications for nonprofits. And the way we typically work with our partners is in 3 ways. So first, we assess their current fundraising practices, their strengths, the opportunities to improve. And then we identify strategies and tactics and a reasonable plan for them to achieve their goals, but really trying to take into account the limitations that a lot of charities, especially small ones, face. And then finally, we like to be hands-on in the execution of these strategies. And so a lot of what I'm going to share with you today comes from the experience that we have had with real charities, a number of which are here today. So let's jump right on in. And so there is a worksheet in your book. There's a blank page, and then if you flip it, there's a 2-page worksheet that you can fill out as we go through. So the number 1 question that we get asked from our prospective clients or once we're working with someone is this. Maybe it looks familiar to you. So they say to us, we are a very small charity and we have extremely limited time and resources. So when it comes to fundraising, where do you think that we should actually be investing those resources to have the biggest bang for our buck? So that's the big question that we're going to hopefully answer today. And I want to start by laying a little bit of groundwork. A number of you might know this already, but some of you may not. And so the diagram on the left-hand side is the donor cycle. This is basically a representation of the typical journey that a donor will have with an organization. And I just want to touch on it because this is sort of going to lay the foundation of language that we're going to be using for the rest of this conversation. So you'll see that the first step is acquisition, so that's that blue arrow on the far left-hand side. So that's how a donor first comes in contact with an organization. It's you figuring out who they are and how you're going to find them. Second is cultivation, so the yellow arrow on top there. And this is like the first few dates with an organization that a prospective donor goes on. It's getting to know your mission, your impact, seeing if there's a value alignment. And yeah, and it leads towards the solicitation, which is in red. This is when you ask them for a specific amount of money at a specific time for a specific purpose, hopefully. Yeah, and then the last part is stewardship. So this is what comes after somebody gives. And this is hopefully where you're communicating gratitude and impact and doing it regularly and repeatedly. But we'll talk about that later. So we'll set that aside. And so back to the question, where do you invest your resources to have the biggest impact? I would argue that retention is the place to do that. And so what exactly is donor retention? Let's start with that. So donor retention is the number of your organization's donors that gave to you last year and also gave to you again this year, typically reflected as a percentage. You might have heard of donor attrition, which is sort of the opposite of that. That's how many donors are falling off from your organization every year. However, donor retention is a much more positive way to look at it. So we're going to go with that today. Okay, so how do you calculate this? You, again, may or may not know this, but there is space to write this down on your worksheet. This is the calculation. So you take the number of donors that gave both in 2016 and 2017, and you divide that by the total number of donors that gave in 2016. Okay, so let's say in 2016 you had 100 donors give to your organization, and then in 2017, 37 of those people gave again. So 37 over 100, your retention rate is 37%. So there's an example on your worksheet, I think, of charity ABC. So at your leisure, you can complete that calculation and figure out what ABC's retention rate is. So great, so you might know this already. Perhaps some of you know what it is for your organization, and maybe you don't. I would encourage you to figure it out when you get back to the office next week. So what is the average? What are we benchmarking against here? So a Bloomerang survey in 2017 reflected that the industry average for donor retention is 47%. So, and that's actually been a number that's been decreasing year over year over the last decade. The highest donor retention we're finding is in religious-based organizations, lowest donor retention among health and human service organizations. The highest donor retention rate I've come across in my professional life has been around upwards of 70%. So there is a lot of opportunity to improve for most organizations. Just because I know someone will ask this, the new donor retention rate is actually quite a bit lower. So it's only 23%. So that means that 2 out of 10 donors that give to your organization for the first time are having a good enough experience with you that they're going to give again. So we're not specifically going to talk about a second gift strategy today, but a lot of what we will talk about is can sort of be applied to new donors, but just kind of amplified. Everything you do for new donors just kind of needs to be on steroids. So anyways, so maybe you're thinking, well, we keep making more money every year, so does it really matter if we're retaining our donors well? I would argue that yes, and this is where I'd like to insert my joke of the day. So, what is 10 times more painful, expensive, and arduous than thanking donors, sorry. Oh dear. Than thanking donors, acquiring them. Thank you. Got to work on that a little more. Next year. All right, so now we're going to speak a little bit about why donors love us and leave us. So I think the best place to start is to look at why donors are falling off from organizations in the first place, because perhaps you can reflect a little bit on your own organizations. You can see if this is true, and then we're going to go into talking a little about some tools and tips for how to prevent this from happening and to sort of hopefully increase your donor retention over the next couple of years. So some of the volunteers are going to spread out into the audience, because I'd like to ask you, why do you think donors are falling off from your organization? Why do you think that they stop giving? Anybody? All right, we've got lots of answers.
Because you don't ask for another donation. Simple as that.
Yep, all right.
No follow-up from the first donation.
No follow-up, okay. Okay, great. So she said not enough thank yous, not enough stewardship. I think you have.
They don't know the impact of their gift.
Uh-huh. Yep.
Our #1 donor died.
Yes, that's true. That happens. That's real life. Okay. On that note, let's just move right along, shall we? Okay. So, no, it's true. See, statistically proven that 16% of donors stop giving because they pass away. But this comes from a Network for Good survey, which happened in 2013. And this is what they found to be the top reasons why donors stop giving. So they can no longer afford it, they pass away, but also because of poor service and communication, they're never thanked for their donation, they have no memory of supporting the charity, all these kinds of things. And so while, if we take the first two, or the first and the third one out, what we see is a common theme, which a lot of your answers reflected as well, which is poor communication. And I think that a lot of you probably know this already, and you're thinking, okay, I've heard this before, good, good, good. But unless you have a donor retention rate that's up in the 70s, this is important to be refreshed on and reminded. So hopefully today we'll find some opportunities for you to really make an impact in 2018 with your donor communication and retention. So back to our friend, the donor cycle. Where do we think that this communication breakdown is really occurring for our donor community? As someone mentioned back here, it's really in the stewardship part of it. So that's where you're thanking a donor for their gift, you're communicating with them, or maybe not, and that's okay because we can fix that. But the best part about the fact that the breakdown is happening in the stewardship cycle is that this is very easy to fix. With a little bit of intention, a little bit of a plan, we can make a big difference here. Okay, so before we move on, I'd like you to use your imaginations just a little bit, because I think that sometimes we think that stewardship is not that important, or it doesn't really matter, or that no one really notices if we're not doing it well. So I'd like to make this personal. So think about, imagine you have a niece. She's 15 years old, and this is now the year when she's allowed to go to the movies by herself with her friends. So she no longer has to go with her parents. And this is a really big deal because she really likes movies. And so you know that her birthday is 2 weeks away, and so you go down to the movie theater and you get a gift card for like $50, and that's good enough for, I don't know, like 1 movie ticket now because it's so expensive, but like 2 movie tickets and like some popcorn or something like this. And you go to the store and you pick out a card and you write this great message and you put it in an envelope and you walk it to the post office and then you wait. And you're like, okay, great, it's probably gonna get there before her birthday. Her birthday comes and goes and you hear nothing. There's no thank you. There's no acknowledgement that she even got it. Did it get lost in the mail? I don't know. And then you never hear, what movie did she go see? Did she take friends? Did she get popcorn? And then as the year goes along, her birthday starts approaching again. And you start thinking, okay, well, you know, I don't really know if she really cared or if she appreciated it or if it was really that valuable for her. So I'm just gonna skip this year. I'm gonna sit this one out. And so you don't get her a birthday present. And so this is basically what happens to our donors all the time, unfortunately. And so sometimes thinking about it in a more personal way can help emphasize why the stewardship process is really so important. All right. So what are donors actually looking for when it comes to communications? So this one's taken straight out of the Penelope Burke playbook, who's one of my favorites. If you don't know her, please look her up. She wrote a fantastic book called Donor-Centered Fundraising, which is basically like the stewardship Bible for fundraisers, so it should definitely be on your shelf. And so she outlines that for donors to really feel stewarded and appreciated and brought closer to an organization, they require 3 basic things. So the first one is receiving prompt and meaningful acknowledgements whenever a gift is made. So a quick thank you message. So I test drove this morning actually with one of the charities that we do donor relations work for, and a gift came in and I got the little bing, you got a gift. So I actually emailed this person as soon as I got the message, and a few minutes later they wrote back and they were like, oh, really? There's like a human that works at this charity? This is amazing. And she shared with me a bunch of information about why she chose this organization and all of the things that were meaningful to her about this gift, even though it was only $10. And it advanced that relationship significantly. So prompt gratitude, messages of gratitude are really important. So one of the studies that Penelope Burke did reflected that 78% of donors would definitely, or most likely, give again to a charity that provided them with a prompt personal acknowledgement followed by a meaningful update on a program that they funded. So when we think about the fact that new donor retention is 23% and the average donor retention is 48%, and then you find out that 8% of people would give again if we just thank them well, all of a sudden you're starting to think, wow, this could really make a big difference. Okay, the next thing that Penelope says is really important for donor communications is to have the gift assigned to a specific program, project, or initiative that narrows the mission of the organization. So really, it's narrowing the gap and the distance between the donor and the impact that they're making in the world, making it mission specific. So in a study that was done by the Case Foundation, they found that 60% of donors want impact and success stories, and these donors are more likely to renew their support when they know that your organization is making a positive impact in the world. So a number of our clients will say to us, like, well, we never hear back from people when we send them an impact report or a story, or so we don't really think that they care or that they like it. But I would argue differently. I would argue that they probably do appreciate it. You've just not asked them to respond, so they've read it and moved on. So I would encourage you that this is actually quite important. And the third and final thing that donors are looking for in communications from organizations they give to is receiving a report in measurable terms about what was accomplished with the last gift before they get asked for another. Makes sense, right? So this reiteration of gratitude and impact is really important. They require multiple touch points before they're going to consider giving again. And if you work at a small charity, you're probably thinking, like, I don't have time for this, okay? Like, I'm just trying to keep my head above water. But I'd encourage you that touch points don't actually have to be that complicated. Anything from leaving a voicemail with them after they give, to a handwritten note on a tax receipt, to an impact report 3-6 months later about what you actually did with their gift. Like, those are all fantastic touch points and resonate deeply with donors. I would recommend starting with at least 3 touch points between gifts. Ideally, I'd say you'd like 5 if possible. But yeah, just consider your own organization and if you're making a point of reaching out to donors multiple times between solicitations. Okay, so now let's talk about some tools and tips for actually bringing this to life. The first thing I think is worth mentioning, as you can tell, I'm a big Penelope Burke fan. She was here last year in the summer. AFP hosted a conference in the Fraser Valley where she came out, and it was like all of these fundraisers went totally fangirl on her. It was fantastic. But anyways, so at that conference, she said that gratitude is not the last step in a campaign, but the first step towards your next gift. And I think that this is a great place to start in a conversation around how to implement retention or to improve retention at your organization, because I think it really starts with a shift in culture and how you look at donors and how you look at the process of giving. And when you start to think about the gratitude piece coming first, it immediately puts like a significant amount of respect on your donors for making that choice and a commitment to drawing them in further to your organization in a long-term relationship and not just really seeing them as a cash cow. So here are some tips and tricks and friendly reminders about how to be great at stewardship. Now, stewardship is not rocket science. I understand that. And so if you're thinking here that you've heard this before, I'd like you to think of it from the perspective of, if you were to give to your organization today under a fake name, are these things, like, would these things actually happen? Would you experience this yourself? And if the answer is no, then perhaps thinking about some different ways that you could change that to a yes. All right, so first of all, stewardship should be personal. We can mail merge people's first names into things and all this kind of stuff now, but the personal touch goes a long way with donors because now they want to know that there's actually a human being at the organization whose hands this tax receipt has passed through, or who has actually thought for ever so briefly a moment how important this donor is to the organization. And so I have written a few sample thank you letters. The first one is typical, I would say. So it says, "Dear Mr. Sam Smith, thank you very much for your donation to our charity. We have been working hard for over 40 years to bring clean water to people in Kenya. Our teams work hard every day to save lives, and your donation helps us build new programs to bring our vision to life. Thank you, from Carrie Bergrid, Development Director." Okay, so It's not terrible, but it could be better, I think, especially when it comes to the personalization of this. So here is the updated version. Hi, Sam. Wow. Thank you so much for your gift of $55 that you made on Tuesday evening. We are so grateful. With it, you're championing clean water in Kenya and are transforming lives. I know that our team couldn't do this without you. With much gratitude, Rebecca. Rebecca Bennett, President and CEO. Okay, so what are the things about this updated thank you note that really stand out? I would suggest there's a few. First of all, I am a firm believer that unless your donors tell you otherwise, you can address them by their first name. This just makes it personal right off the bat. Now, there are people who will call you back and tell you, like, I am not Sam, I am Mr. Smith, and you're like, okay, make a note of it, but I think until they tell you, it's okay to call them by their first name. The second is don't be afraid, this is so simple, but don't be afraid to use bold and underline when you write letters. Use highlighters, different colored pens, point things out. It's okay, because again, it shows that this is actually passed through the hands or the keyboard of a human being, okay? Specificity, $55 on Tuesday evening. I am all for like things that autofill, but this just suggests again that someone has noticed in the moment what's going on and appreciates this donor. With it, you're championing clean water in Kenya. We couldn't do this without you. This is, and I know you've probably heard this earlier today, but this is making your donor the champion of this story. This is not about you. This is not about your organization. This is about them and the impact that they are making. And this reads very differently than, our team can now do this, and we're so great, and you're helping us continue being great, right? This is about you as a donor making a change in the world. And finally, I'm also a firm believer that letters like this should come from the top of an organization. And that doesn't belittle what a development director does. It simply reflects the kind of how serious donors take giving. They want to know that the person at the top is stewarding this gift, has noticed, and will put it to as good use as possible. All right, the third and final reminder about great stewardship is to reiterate gratitude. So I think we can all agree that it takes multiple times for people to tell us something for it really to sink in. We don't always get it the first time around. And so it's the same with gratitude. A voicemail followed up by a thank you card, followed up by an impact report, slowly but surely just drills in that message of impact and appreciation with donors. So I would encourage you to think that, one message of gratitude is great, but 3 or 5 is even better. And if you remember nothing else about stewardship, there we go, number 3. Remember this, which is from a friend of mine named Rose, who has been an institution in Vancouver's fundraising community for years. And I was talking with her over coffee a few weeks ago as I prepared for this conference, and she told me this. She was like, just tell them that for donors, giving is always personal. It's always personal. No matter how much someone is giving, it's always a personal experience for them. And so as you approach your stewardship and your donor retention, just remember that. And it'll come together properly when you remember that for them, this is significant, and it always will be. However, it's not just about stewardship. You actually still need to ask your donors to give. And we heard this sort of during that, the popcorn sort of when people shared their thoughts here. You still need to ask as much as you need to thank them. And so I'd like to remind you that the #1 reason why people do not give to charity these days is because they are not asked to give to charity. So it's important that we continue to solicit our donors at least once a year and give them the opportunity to participate in the impact that's happening in our communities. So you, let's say, are part of a small team. You don't have a lot of time, so how does this actually come to life for your organization to solicit your donors? Well, I would suggest a retention campaign at the end of the year. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy, it just has to be intentional. All right, so how does this look? So the first step is to pull a list out of your donor database or out of your Excel sheets about people who gave last year but have not yet given this year. Start there, and then you can take that and make your campaign, so let's say a letter that goes out in the mail, specific to this segment of donors, recognizing that you know that they haven't yet given this year, but you appreciate everything they've done in the years past. So here's an example of what that can look like. Okay, so hi Sam. We are so grateful for your generous support in years past. You've truly been a champion for people in our community. This holiday season, I'd like to invite you to continue transforming people's lives in Vancouver by making a gift. I'll make sure that your support gets put to work right away, providing a safe, warm, welcoming place for our community members to truly belong. Looking forward to hearing from you soon, Baz. So, what are we noticing about this letter? So again, first name, addressing donors with their first name to make it personal, and then making this specific to this segment that you are writing to. You know that they've given in the past. They've been a huge part of getting you to where that you are today, and you want them to continue doing that with you. Again, it's an invitation, so it's an opportunity to impact versus any sort of guilt-ridden obligation to give. And also using the word I instead of we. I think that makes it more personal. And then again, from the president and CEO and hand signed. All right, so you put your letter in the mail, it's segment specific, and then what? Do you just wait and just cross your fingers and hope that donations come in? Some of them might. You might get a handful, but I would encourage you strongly to follow up. This is not pestering your donor, this is recognizing and respecting that they are busy people and that sometimes they're not always thinking about you, so you're going to help them by following up with them. So after you send your letter, you could send an e-blast maybe 10 days later, so you know that the letter's arrived, and like 3 to 4 days after the letter arrives, you send an e-blast that has a lot of the same characteristics, imagery, language as the letter, just generally following up with a button to give. Okay, then what? Well, I'd suggest that you get a little group of your staff or your board together and you make some follow-up calls. And these don't need to be pushy, they don't need to be direct solicitations. They can be messages of gratitude. Thank them for their past support. And then ask them, do you have any questions about the letter that we sent you? Is this something that you're interested in? And trust me when I say that they will tell you. They will tell you if they're interested, and they will definitely tell you if they are not. But all of that's really good information for you to have. And then you can follow up. I think an email right before the end of the tax year is always a really good idea, just as one sort of last soft push in case anyone has forgotten to give during the year. So one of our clients that we did this with this year, they did a retention campaign for the first time, and they sent it to a group of donors who had given in 2017, as well as a group who hadn't given in 2017, but had given the year before. And over 65% of the gifts that came in came from that second segment of people who hadn't yet given. And I think if they hadn't opened up that opportunity, a number of those donors would not have renewed this year. So they were able to continue that relationship on with them because they put in the time to send the solicitation and then gently follow up with them. Okay, so that's a lot. How are we gonna stay organized and on top of all this? Surprise! I know they're sponsoring this. I know Najid and I have been friends for a long time. However, this is honestly, like, our team was raised on razor's edge. We really were. And since building Fawkes and Holly, we've worked with all sorts of different donor databases. And for small organizations and medium-sized ones that are looking to sort of really just get into donor data and retention, Keela is fantastic for it. So one of the things that we believe is that as your charity grows and matures, it's really, really important to keep your data up to date, so keeping it really clean, and then also keeping it in a place where everybody who might come in contact with a donor can have access to it. And this is because if you're cultivating this atmosphere and experience of donors that they're known personally by your organization, you need to give them that when they get in touch with you. So we've all had that where someone calls you, and they're like, hi, this is Mary. And you're like frantically looking through your email being like, who is Mary? Who is this Mary? But she's talking to you like you know who she is. And that's exactly kind of what I think the goal should be, that every donor feels known by your organization. So, what kind of information helps you do that? So in a donor profile, I think there should be a number of things. This is but a small list of them. And I realize this is not all going to happen at once. This is information that's curated over the course of a donor relationship, but it's kind of the goal. So giving history, of course, date, amount, source of the gift, the basic contact information that you have. So taking the time to pull all that information off of checks and get it all into there is important. Their preferred name, if you know it, is great. Family information, their spouse's name, their children's names, whatever they're giving you as you get to know them, you can drop that in there. The relationship that they have to the organization or to other donors. They assume that you know how they're connected, and so let's make sure that we're keeping track of that. If they have a preferred contact at your organization, someone they really enjoy talking to or who really holds all of the knowledge about this donor, you want to mark that down. And then the last two are probably the most important to me. I think that everyone should be tracking each interaction that donors are having with an organization. So some people call this actions, Keela calls it interactions, but it over time will show you a timeline of the relationship that you have with your donors and can be really valuable in helping you to take the next steps and see what the appropriate next steps are for a segment or just for that one donor. And then, of course, a reminder of the next time that you want to be in touch with them. And so, yeah, every donor should really feel like they're known by your team, no matter who picks up the phone at your organization. So, there might be some skeptics in the room. That's okay. So what I would like to do is just run you through ever so briefly a case study of one of our clients who was skeptical about practicing good donor retention and has actually seen quite a bit of success by doing a lot of the things that we've just talked about. So here it is. So what you can see here is that this is revenue from this donor or this organization's annual fund only, so this doesn't take into account grants or major gifts or anything like that. And so as you can see in the second row there, this organization is quite good at acquiring new donors. They've had a lot of success with it. They have some like tried and true principles and exercises that they do year over year. So let's just assume that they keep doing well at that. And then though you can see highlighted in yellow, that they did not have a very good donor retention rate in 2015. So they were sitting at 30%. So while they were replacing a lot of their donors with new donors, there was also a lot of people falling off every year. And so starting sort of towards the end of 2015 and into 2016, we started implementing just basic practice, prompt thank yous, story-based impact reports, personalized stewardship, and then, of course, at least one solicitation a year. And you can see the difference that this started to make. And so not only has their retention rate gone up, but of course, they're actually, their revenue went up quite a bit by 40% or so. And so if nothing else, I'd like to convince you of the fact that practicing strong donor retention and stewardship is actually just good for the bottom line of your organization. All right, so before we get to questions and answers, I just want to wrap this up. So, if you remember only 4 things from this time that we're spending together, these are them. Donor retention is the easiest way for you to increase your revenue and expand your donor base at your organization. Strong, timely, personal stewardship is the linchpin of strong donor retention. You still need to solicit your donors to retain them well, so don't be afraid of that. And then, of course, data integrity is also a really important part of successful donor retention. And that's it. So I'd like to invite Najid up, as he's going to help me out with a question and answer period in case you have any burning questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Before we start, ladies and gentlemen, Leigh Schumann. Thank you. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, donor engagement, donor retention, fundraising is such an important part of all of our organizations. And so we've actually left a decent amount of time, 15, 20 minutes of this conversation for your questions. The problem is I need you to actually ask them. So with that in mind, I think we have Phil and Gabriel. If you could throw your hands up. I'm not an expert. Oh, and Sam in the corner, who are going to be runners with mics. So if you could throw your hand up and ask follow-up questions, any burning questions you may have about especially donor retention, but also sort of general fundraising strategy, of which Leigh is, of course, an expert. I saw a hand. Phil?
There's one right here, too.
So two
Hi,
quick.
Navita.
Hi. Hi, Leigh.
Hi. Oh, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Two quick questions. So if 60% of donors want impact and success stories, that also means potentially 40% don't.
Uh-huh.
And so if somebody says that they don't want so many touch points, is that something that you have experienced that does happen? So that was one question. And the second question was, if somebody decides to not become a donor anymore because of financial reasons, because that was like 56%, at what point would you reach out to them again, or is that like a no forever kind of protocol?
Great questions. And I would love to hear other people's thoughts on this, because I have just one brain. But so to the first question, I think that donor preference and what they give to you and ask of you it trumps everything else. So I think that if a donor asks you to ease up on touch points, things like that, you need to respect that and respond appropriately. That said, I've also heard people say that donors don't actually necessarily know what they want. So perhaps don't take them off of your list altogether. Maybe just take them off of a lot of your stuff and then send them one thing a year, like an annual report with a personal cover letter. And then to the second question, which was... Right. Yes. Okay, so if they say they can't afford to give anymore, I would say take them off your solicitations for a year or two, depending on how many you do, and then come back to them. I think also asking, I think a lot of times donors will give you some information up front. So, like, I just lost my job, I'm in transition, things like that. That's not a no, never. That's a no, not right now. And so I would suggest make it clear that not this year, but to keep them in the loop. And I think that reflects a lot of respect to donors. I think people think that we only care about them when they give, which is not true, or hopefully isn't true. And so reflecting that you've heard them and that you still appreciate them is important. So I would suggest keeping them on your impact reports and making a little note, like all your support in the past has really helped this to happen and come to life, things like that. And then return to that conversation in a little while.
Just one quick follow-up on that. You can always ask them to engage in other ways too. So
Absolutely.
Volunteer, events, tweets, I don't know, whatever people do these days. But donors are more than just their money, right? And that's something we have to always remember.
Okay. Yeah, just as a follow-up to that one before I ask my question. You can also, most people, if you ask them, if they're in financial troubles or whatever, you ask them, when can I contact you again? They'll tell you, right?
Absolutely.
So, and the volunteer thing is a good thing too. But my question is about the tracking interactions.
Yes.
And being a not so infrequent donor myself, really bugs me when you've already donated and then you keep getting more requests for donations from the same organization. It almost feels like not everyone, but a lot of charities these days seem like political parties where they keep sending you donation requests even though you may or may not have donated, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's interesting. It's very different small shop to big shop. Like I used to work at UGM, and on the bottom of the tax receipts, they used to have a solicitation, which brought in a ton of money every year. So, like it depends, I would say. But as best practice for smaller organizations, I would say that point around touch points and stewardship is probably quite important, and especially given the experience you've had. It can really put you off if you don't get the opportunity to be appreciated.
How difficult is it to track?
Oh, not difficult. You can probably speak to this better.
This is not a Keela sales conversation. I want to be really clear about that. Look, whatever you're doing, if it's I use a lot of postits. I do it's terrible for the environment, but whatever way you are tracking it, it's important that you build a system that, to somebody's point, works, right? And I think that's really important. Of course, there's technology. We have so much at our fingertips and so many opportunities for that, but whatever you use it. And I think that's the key message that I would share.
Okay, I disagree. Do not use postits because you'll lose them. I think for a short amount of time. Okay, so I think that taking the whole point of this conversation is that a lot of you know this already, but the point is that most of you are not actually doing it, or else we wouldn't be talking about this today. And so taking the time to put interactions into your donor database will drastically change the way that you're able to segment your donors and approach them and treat them with the respect that they deserve, and you probably hopefully think they deserve as well. So when you're pulling lists for solicitations, you can pull out all the people who gave in the past couple of months, who haven't received yet their impact report, or however it is that you'd like to segment that group.
Hi, so I sit on the board for a small charity, a youth-based charity, and our board and all our staff are all very young. Mm-hmm. And so my question for you is, in trying to expand or solicit new donors, mm-hmm. is it okay to ask current donors to invite their friends to become donors? And how do you do that?
Yeah, I think that it's totally appropriate to do that. I would invite them first, though, to ask people to start caring about what you do. So the first step is that cultivation piece, right? And that's really those first dates, get to know us, get to know you, that whole thing. So I'd invite them into an opportunity to bring their friends or their network into relationship with your organization. And then you can take the next steps forward after you kind of all have aligned that you're on the same page about things. Yeah?
Do you have any suggestions about how to address the idea that a lot of frontline staff might actually be having interactions with donors and they don't want to spend the time or don't necessarily have the technological expertise to be entering something into a CRM, or it really isn't their priority, mm-hmm. and yet then when I want to go and make a thank you phone call, I miss this key piece of activity that they've just done. Do you have any suggestions to address that?
The problem is humans, right? Not the technology. I think that's the reality of it super often. I think, at least from my 20-something years in the space, I'd say teaching them is really important, or building a system where they can do something that's best for them, that either an administrative support staff or doing something just so that when you do that ask, you don't look stupid, right? Because if somebody on the front lines has done that, that's the worry. But I'm going to defer to Leigh.
Yeah, I think that it's not common, or I wouldn't suggest having your frontline staff solicit donors, and I don't know, that's not what you're talking about. Yeah, you're talking about cultivation, or they come and volunteer or something. I mean, you can build into your volunteering experience sort of checks and balances to help make sure that if donors are volunteering or coming by, that people are seeing that in the fundraising department. But I also think donors are human, and they know that there's only so many hours in a day and so many people that can be on something. So I think that being honest with people is always the best policy. And if you kind of slip up and they're like, oh, I came to volunteer last week, you're like, oh. Right, but just apologize and be honest with them, and that's okay. And then kind of follow up to make sure that you understand when they're coming again, or if they are coming again. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think there's a bit of a hand action to figure out who's going next. So one comment and one question. To your point about donor reporting and the good business of kind of just tracking everything, I think to take that one point further, mm-hmm. is that you want to take your donors and see what's the growth to move them to the next level, i.e. that major gift. Mm-hmm. And if you see that their trajectory is growing and maybe there might be a few years of that they're bumping and higher, then mm-hmm. that's a prime individual to move it further. So I had a question, and with the organizations that you've worked with and the variety of sizes, I have some of my own thoughts, but I just want to hear it from an expert in the business. Is how do you define for a new organization that doesn't necessarily have a major gifts plan mm-hmm. and a program, and you're looking to say, okay, you want to put first what a definition of major gift is, and mm-hmm. how do you qualify it for that organization versus the previous ones that I've been in? What would you say are the best practices to instill?
That's a fantastic question. Some of the biggest organizations that I've worked with have defined major gifts at the lowest level, as like $2,000 and above. I think it's really, it depends on your organization's capacity to treat major gift donors with the time and space and all of that kind of stuff that they really need to make those decisions. So if you only have one person on major gifts, reasonably they can probably only carry like 50 to like 75 donors at a time, because otherwise they're just not going to get to everyone. So I think looking at your gifts and your gift chart and making a decision that way can be quite good. But I also know that there are donors who give at quite a low level, but for them to really have a great donor experience, they need to be treated like they're giving a major gift, because to a lot of donors, every gift they give is a major gift. So you kind of also just have to read the signs that donors are giving you. But if you're looking to stride that, I would say that you want to look at the gift chart and the time that you have to dedicate to a major gifts program.
Thanks. This has been really great reminder on a lot of things.
You.
I have a short question and a longer version of it. The short question is, when do you give up? And the longer version of that is
never.
Yeah. So what I really mean by that is some tips on when you are following up with the donor, you're trying to be creative. You might be sometimes giving them an impact update, sometimes thanking them, sometimes asking for their advice. There's all these different ways to engage them. And although they have given in the past, now you're hearing nothing. And they're not giving you anything to work with. You don't know why. You don't know what to do. What's your advice on dealing with situations like that?
When donors ghost on you.
Yeah.
I would say that after about 2 years, you want to move them into sort of like a lapsed donor category. And that doesn't mean that you're not contacting them at all anymore. It just means that the way that you're approaching them reflects, as we talked about before, that you recognize that they haven't given to you in a while, and that you miss them, and that you would like them to come back. And, can you share with us why why you've been absent for a while? Because we have these things that are happening that I think you'd really appreciate, or whatever it is. But I think that you basically don't ever give up until you hear from a hard no from them. And even if that's just one lapsed donor solicitation a year, I think it's still worth it, because you just don't know. You really don't know what's changed in their life and what might change again and lead them back to you. So.
Hi, a question slightly away from retention,
Yes.
but looking at organizations, you're talking about organizations raising money. How do you change the culture within organizations, small charities, such that the board, the staff, the volunteers all understand that fund development is not the sole responsibility and the task of the fund dev manager?
Oh, that's a great question.
Pitch the next session for a quick second, where we're going to talk about impact tracking and impact measurement, where hopefully some of those answers come, but then I'm going to get back.
Yes. I think that sharing stories from donors is a really great place to start. It sounds really simple, but it starts to sort of do this like inception-y thing where people all of a sudden start to not fear fundraising anymore, and they don't fear donors, because I think that's a lot of the roots of why perhaps a culture of philanthropy doesn't take root at organizations. So I would say start by sharing positive stories from your donors and why it's meaningful for them to give. And then second, I would encourage you to engage your staff or your volunteers or board or whoever it is in a thankathon, which is arguably like the best tool I think that fundraisers ever came up with, which is just picking up the phone and calling all your donors and saying thank you, and that's it. And the goal is really to get like thank you and the name of your organization in the same sentence, and you can do it yourself, you can have your board do it, you can have like beneficiaries of your organization do it, and it doesn't need to be pretty, it just needs to be genuine. And so I think that positive interactions with donors that are non-threatening and sort of show people that philanthropy can be fun and exciting and are great steps to start taking.
How often do you recommend recognizing and communicating with monthly donors?
Oh, that's a great question. So monthly donors, I think, should always get at least one specific thank you a year. It's about the fact that, they're monthly donors, this is the impact you're making, things like that. But I think that getting sort of a quarterly update as well can be really good. But specific to the fact that they're monthly donors, I would say at least once a year. Mm-hmm. Thankathons can be great for that too, specifically for monthly donors. It's sort of like a special little thing for them.
I'm going to say this because Leigh's not going to say it, but to answer your question, the best way that we have started to shift our whole board staff volunteer culture, and we're a small nonprofit, is to hire Leigh, Fawkes and Holly. and really, well, I'm saying that because I think everybody is, in a small organization, you are always struggling with what do we do next to move ourselves to this next level. And I think particularly for our board, having somebody external come in, and I might have been saying some things, or just to hear it in a different way. And I think that's been hugely helpful for us on so many levels. So thank you. And I wasn't paid to say that, but I'm just saying you might want to consider working with consultants that can really help to start to shift that culture. So
thank you. I think also to Heather's point sort of is this idea that sometimes people just need to sort of be told, like, you can trust this process, like this is normal. And I think at small organizations we don't always know what normal looks like in a fundraising world or in a donor relationship, and that can be a lot of why things stall out. And also I think that laying a strong foundation of infrastructure around a database or around stewardship practices or reporting practices are really important, because it means that you can actually trust what happens after your donors give. So there's a lot more excitement around, well, let's get them to give because we trust what the next year is going to look like from their point of view and in their experience. And so I think it's kind of a combination of all those things. But thank you very much for saying that.
So there's a conventional wisdom in charities that there's obviously a break between major gifts and annual giving. And a lot of charities will have a sort of a cutoff point for lower level gifts, whether it's 20, 10, or 5 or whatever. In your experience, is that cutoff often too high? Should it be lower to engage in the kind of stewardship that you're talking about?
That's a really fantastic question. I think that I think you should basically attempt to treat all of your donors the same until it just becomes unreasonable to continue doing so, at which point hopefully you're bringing in enough revenue that you can hire another person to help continue that experience for your donors. There's also something, I should have brought a slide of it, but it's called a stewardship matrix. And it's sort of, it's an outline of all your stewardship activities for the year, sort of on the y-axis, and then across the top are giving levels, so like 0 to 99 and 100 to 500 or whatever. And it sort of helps you stay organized on, like, everybody that gives to our organization will get a thank you call from somebody. But only the people who give above $1,000 will get a call from a board member or something like that. So the idea is that you can see, okay, great, like anyone who gives to our organization will actually get a personal experience and a strong stewardship experience, but there are certain things that we do reserve for people who are giving at the higher levels.
Do you have any suggestions for how to deal with donor retention with foundations?
I don't. No, just simply because we don't actually work with foundations really ourselves. We don't do grant writing or anything like that. So
yeah, no, what I mean, yeah. So like a foundation is not the same as a person who's given money to an organization. They have a whole process and machinery. And so do you have any tips about how an organization would thank a foundation for their gift?
Yeah, the best answer from the experience that I have with foundations to give you is that there's always someone at the foundation making a decision. And so the stronger the relationship between you and whoever is on the receiving end of your communications and your applications is, the more likely they're going to go to bat for you and advocate for you in front of the committee when the time comes. So yeah, I would say just applying the same principles to that person, but beyond that, unfortunately, I don't have much experience with grants and foundations.
I know you said that you're supposed to treat all donors the same, but do you have any special considerations for memorial donations?
Oh, that's a great question. So it was about memorial donations and if that should be considered if you should treat them the same. And I would say no, you shouldn't treat them the same, from the sense that it's really important with memorial donations that you acknowledge why they've been given. And I think that speaks to all the points we talked about earlier around personalizing stewardship. But I think that, yeah, that personal piece, recognizing why they've been given, and then I would still consider like reaching out to those donors, but probably in a more segmented way, a much more gentle way, to see if this is something they'd like to continue or not. But I wouldn't write them off completely.